Welcome to Tabletop Tommies, episode 17. I'm Johnny.
And I'm Phil.
And today we're going to be talking about tournaments we've recently been to. Phil's going to talk about the Warlords Cup, where the Pegasus Warlords took on the South Wales Warlords to determine who are the best warlords. And I recently went to Britcon. There was many tournaments all happening at once at Britcon, but we'll talk about that when we get to it. We're going to do a rundown of the tournaments we went to so that if you're considering them for next year, you'll have a good idea of what to expect. And if you're currently planning a tournament, there may be some things for you to consider for your event. And just as a reminder to anyone who's planning to come to the English Open but hasn't bought their ticket yet, head to tabletoptommies.com for the link to buy a ticket now. Phil, the Warlords Cup, is that a new thing?
So the Warlords Cup, this was the first time it had run, and it is going to be an annual event between the Pegasus Warlords, who are based in Aldershot, and the South Wales Warlords, who are based in Cardiff.
Nice, an annual grudge match then.
Well, it will be after the results this year, yeah.
Spoilers. So what was the format this year?
So for the format this year, it was a club event, so it's a team event. Both clubs brought 8 players, and it was held at Factorum in Warminster, which is near enough in between Cardiff and Aldershot. So the format for the event, it was 1,000 points, single generic reinforced platoon. There were no limits to order dice. There was a little bit of a limit in terms of 2 flamethrowers and 1 multi-launcher, and you couldn't bring characters and warplanes, the usual sort of restrictions you'd expect to see. And where it came from was Andy Tarrant, who set up Pegasus Warlords back in early 22. He'd been chatting with Rhys Bevan, who is the chair of the South Wales Warlords. They'd been talking last year, and then from that came the idea of the Warlords Cup.
So 2 flamethrowers, 1 multi-launcher. So it wasn't no holds barred.
Well, it wasn't no holds barred. So there was a bit of a disparity between the lists that each club brought. So I think it is fair to say that those of us who were playing for Pegasus, a few of us absolutely leaned into the restrictions and we said, right, single generic platoon, it's a club event. We want to do as well as we can for Pegasus. So we built our lists according to the restrictions. The guys from South Wales Warlords, they had strong competitive lists. You didn't see, the 4 or 5 Gurkha lists that myself and Simon brought from Pegasus, for example. So there was a bit of a mismatch, but, we built our list given the restrictions in the pack.
Yeah, and that's all you can really ask of anyone, isn't it, at the end of the day?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's the nice thing, when you've got very tight restrictions. Yes, you might come up against a mismatch where someone's brought the Gurkhas, but if you knew it was allowed, I don't see any huge problem with that.
No, absolutely.
So what did you take specifically, Phil?
So I took a British reinforced platoon. This was 16 order dice at 1,000 points. It was your standard inexperienced second lieutenant with an extra man. I had 4 Gurkha power squads. They were 7-man squads. 3 of them had 2 SMGs. 1 had a single SMG. I had my regular engineers with a flamethrower, 5-man squad. Inexperienced medium mortar, regular light artillery with a spotter, Bren carrier for the engineers, and your Dacre Stewart. Oh, and the observer as well. It's a fairly normal competitive Gurkha Stewart engineer list. I did throw in some new units just to try out some different ones. So I had a veteran Blacker Bombard team in my anti-tank slot, and I also had the 3 early war motorcycle and sidecar combo with the LMGs.
So I guess we'll find out how they went as we go through your games. I'm excited to find out with those 2. So game 1, who was game 1 against?
So game 1 was against Josh Carpenter, and it was sectors. Josh had I want to say like 14 or 15 dice British list, 1 or 2 Gurkhas, regular infantry with a couple of LMGs in them. Had a heavy howitzer, heavy mortar. He had a Stewart, but he'd taken the flamethrower Stewart rather than a Dacre Stewart. Sniper and that sort of thing. So fairly kind of good, strong British list, not overly Gurkha-y. So yeah, we played sectors. Really great game. I hadn't played Josh before. I've obviously met him on the circuit. We'd been at the Welsh Open last year, for example, together, and I've seen him at other events as well. So really, really enjoyable game. I won that one pretty much as sort of turn 4, 5, 6. It kind of turned. So was under a bit of pressure at the start of the game, and then once I'd managed to knock out the artillery, I think it was about turn 2 or so, it basically freed up the middle of the board to allow me to advance forward with the Gurkhas. So yeah, that was that one. In terms of how the special guest units did, my bombard, so I deployed my bombard in my bottom left corner behind a woods, completely out of sight, because he had a sniper parked pretty closely in the middle of the board, and I didn't want to lose it, to getting sniped early doors. So I think I spent 5 turns running and 1 turn shooting. So I had 1 shot the entire game for the bombard, which missed, but I did score a point because I got myself into the scoring neutral zone.
Worth it then, to be fair.
Absolutely worth it. Yeah, that 52 points for a veteran bombard, which basically hid out the way of the sniper. Once the sniper had been dealt with, it then just moved forward into the scoring zone.
Yeah.
In terms of the bikes, I used them in as a group of 3 effectively. So rather than kind of splitting them off and making them vulnerable, I basically brought them on my right hand side in the neutral zone, and they were very good at basically putting pins out, which is what they were there for. Obviously, they had recce as well if I needed to get out of dodge. I did push them forward a bit too far. So the middle of the board, there was quite a big empty space. And I definitely lost 1 to being assaulted, obviously, because it's they're pretty easy to destroy in close assault. So I think I'd moved up and put some pins out. I'd underestimated what 12 inches looked like, or overestimated. And then he charged in and managed to get rid of one of them, which was a good learning point for me, because I haven't used them very often. So I absolutely need to be aware of how far I push them forward and how exposed they can get.
Yeah. And if you are going to be that aggressive, last dice is always your friend, isn't it? Because then it gives you that recce ability at the start of next turn.
Absolutely, yeah. But no, really, really enjoyable game. So yeah, that was game 1 against Josh.
So as you're talking about Josh there, I just want to give a shout out as well for Frozen and the Chosen, which is his career tournament. So using the Bolt Action Career supplement, it's a tournament based on that rule set at Firestorm Games in Cardiff on the 8th and 9th of June. Did one last year, huge success. I think this year's will be just as good, if not better. So did the dice count matter for this one?
So dice count did matter. So it was done on units lost. So I think I lost 5 maybe units in the first game. So I didn't lose too many in the first game. So I was sitting pretty at the end of game 1 before I went into the game with Reese. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to do it, because it encourages the defensive play rather than the offensive.
To be honest, I actually didn't realise at the start of game 1 if it was dice lost or dice taken. So I actually went really aggressive in the first game, but still didn't lose that many, luckily. So,
Phew. So 1-0 so far?
1-0 so far, yeah. So my second game was against Reese, and Reese had a 14 dice US Marine army. A very, very veteran heavy, pretty much entirely vets. So I think he had 3 veteran squads, BARs and pistols and that sort of stuff. A couple of engineers with flamethrowers in dodges, your usual multi-launcher, a mortar, recce jeep, MMG recce jeep, that sort of thing.
What mission was it?
So we were playing key positions, and we had 4 objectives in this one. So in terms of the board, it was a classic sort of Normandy town board, the one with the cobbled streets. Quite a few buildings there. I was aware of the multi-launcher. Also, there's a bit of open space in the middle. There was a nice little marketplace going on. And in terms of where the objectives got placed, I think Reese went first, and I think he placed one behind a building on one side. And I went bang in the middle because I basically was thinking, right, I've got a bunch of stubborn Gurkha paras here. So I actually don't mind not having much cover. I think I placed my second one about 12.1 inches away from that.
Classic.
But it was behind a building this time, because I was basically thinking, actually, if I've got a couple in the middle, which within charge distance, I can throw 2 or 3 Gurkha squads towards them and be cause a bit of carnage in the middle in terms of close assaults and so on. And then there was a final objective in sort of towards one side of the board, slightly on basically the opposite side of where the original objective had been placed. So we had kind of 2 roughly just outside deployment zones, or just outside the 12 inches, and then a couple bang in the middle, pretty much.
So did you win that one?
I did win that one, yep. So that went to, I think it went to turn 7. And in terms of sort of the general style, it was very, very cagey. So for about the first 4 turns, not a lot happened. So Reese was pushing up with his skirmishing, BARs, his Marines. There was one objective in the bottom right corner from where I was playing, which was in the crossroads, and I basically placed my bombard within the 24 inches, because obviously the bombard's direct firing. So I had direct line of sight onto this objective, and I basically stuck it on ambush for the entire game. I had to move it a couple of times because he started ranging in with his mortar, but I was essentially trying to lock down that one objective. The 2 central objectives and the one that was behind the house towards the middle as well, that was where we were playing for. But it was very cagey because I wanted to knock out his multi-launcher, and I didn't want to obviously get too close to the buildings early doors, because if I did, he could see a pretty good line of sight of his multi-launcher. So I was going to be in danger of getting hit with a splash, from the 6 inches from the targeted building. Once the multi-launcher had gone, it was then pushing up with the Gurkhas, basically, and just trying to cause some trouble around the middle. So it was quite a slow tactical game. And then, once the key threats had been taken out, it was then a case of just rushing forward and swarming over the objectives, effectively. So I ended up with 3 objectives to his 1.
Nice. At the end of game 2, you're on 2 wins, no losses.
2 wins, no losses. Again, pretty good dice lost. I think I'd lost maybe 2 units, possibly 3 in that game against Reese. So the final game was against James Clark. Again, never played James before, so I hadn't played Reese before either. So it was 3 new opponents, but I had seen them all and met them all at events and so on. And this was kill points. It was meeting engagement. This was on a Stalingrad board, so there were maybe 4 very big buildings, and I think 4 or 5 pieces of ruined, area terrain, and that was it. So very, very open table. James had a British list, and it was a sort of Bren carrier assault list. So he had a Dacre Stewart, had a couple of 5-man Gurkha units in some Brens, had I think at least 1 engineer, if not 2 engineer squads. He had the Humber armoured car, had a Piat and a Jeep, and your usual kind of selection. He didn't have much HE. So for this one, for my deployment, I basically was hiding everything out of sight. So my Gurkhas were kind of hid behind the buildings towards my table edge. He had to come to me. He had the assault, force with regards to having the units in the Bren carriers. So I was kind of waiting for him to come to me. I'd locked down my right flank with my 25-pounder, which pretty much sat most of the game on ambush, just sorting that flank out. It was incredibly cagey. So I think turn 5, the first dice of the game had been taken. So we were basically playing cat and mouse around his Humber and his Piat in the Jeep, which was on my left flank, but it was they were parked behind a building. Not a lot was going on in the center of the board. I had three the Gurkha squads ready to pounce if need be. I had my Bren with my engineers in that area as well.
Did the artillery observers not do anything for either of you earlier in the game?
The artillery observer put some pins out on me, and I think mine scattered off the board, or it might have kind of scattered towards the back of the board and didn't do a lot, to be fair.
Yeah.
So that early, taking that early dice through the artillery observer didn't happen at all.
Yeah, and there was no prep to get the lucky ones, so it's
there was no.
So I can totally see how that becomes super cagey.
Yeah, so turn 5 was the first dice lost, so I think it was 1-0 to me at that point. Turn 4 or turn 5, I had pushed forward a Gurkha unit from behind the area terrain where they were out of sight, just to see if he took the bait. And he did move forward with a Gurkha squad in the Bren beyond the halfway point of the board, so towards my side of the board. That allowed me on turn 6, I think, or maybe turn 5 it was, to push up my engineers in the Bren, and I had another Gurkha squad close by as well. He realised at this point in turn 6 that he basically potentially was going to lose another dice because his Gurkhas in the Bren were exposed, and I had a Gurkha squad, an engineer in the Bren and the Bren itself to basically put some pressure on and try and sneak a dice. So I did. So it was 2-0 at the end of turn 6 to myself, but we rolled for turn 7.
And then you got it, I presume, from the tone of that voice.
So if it had finished on turn 6, I would have won. So I'd have got 3 victories on the day. We played turn 7, and James took 2 of my dice. So it was 2-2. I did take one of his towards the end of turn 7. So it finished 3-2. But because of the mission, you had to have 2 clear dice to win. So that game finished in a draw. So I finished on 2 wins and a draw. I lost 9 dice over all 3 games, and I ended up finishing 3rd overall.
So undefeated, most importantly.
Undefeated. Now, had we not played turn 7 on game 3, I would have won overall.
Nice. Who did win overall on that note?
So Mike Smith won overall. Mike, who was on our episode to talk about the Soviets, he got 3 wins from 3, but his dice count was pretty poor. So he actually finished his game 3 before I finished mine, and he came over and started supporting James, even though we were both playing for the Pegasus Warlords, because he wanted obviously to finish overall in first place.
So good tournament then overall?
Yeah, fantastic. So really nice. So eight of us who travelled over from Aldershot. Eight came down from Cardiff. Factorum's a lovely venue, really nice, and nice tables, nice terrain, and that sort of thing. And it was just played in a really really good spirit. So Pegasus Warlords won overall. Obviously, it was a team event, so we totaled up each individual person's placings and so on. So we won overall. Reese organised a lovely trophy, which Andy now needs to get engraved with Pegasus Warlords for 23, and then there'll be a rematch next year.
Brilliant. And if anyone listening is local to Cardiff and isn't already affiliated with the South Wales Warlords, I believe they play out the Firestorm Games store, don't they?
They're supported by Firestorm Games. They're based in Marshfield Village Hall in Cardiff, so that's where their regular game sessions are. They're very much affiliated and supported by Firestorm Games. Yeah,
fantastic. Well, they're also on Facebook as well, so if you are interested in joining them, you can find them on there. And equally, Pegasus Warlords are on Facebook, so you can find them if you're in the Aldershot area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Pegasus Warlords, they have a monthly games day. It's normally the last Sunday of each month, and that's a couple of games over the course of the day. They've recently started a weekly games evening on a Thursday as well, and they are based at the Game Shop in Aldershot.
So, well done, Phil.
Cheers, Johnny. Thank you.
And well done to Mike for coming first, and well done to Pegasus.
Well done to Pegasus, yeah, and well done to everyone who played. So it was a really, really good fun day. Great tournament, great spirit as well. Yeah.
Brilliant. So, I went to Britcon.
Mm-hmm.
So Britcon was a brilliant weekend. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Gaz Betts was a TO. He's been TOing Warlord GTs for years. Really good stash of terrain. Puts out a really good spread. It was a brilliant weekend. I also spoke to Will from 7th City Collectibles, which is just outside of Nottingham, I believe. It's a store there. Good little bolt action community. He hadn't been to a tournament for about 10 years. And he said he really enjoyed it. He's going to be signing up to more going forwards. So that's really a good sign of that the tournament did go really well, regardless of anything that we thought could be better as we go through. So I think I'll give a sort of a summary at the beginning rather than at the end, because obviously as I'm going through, that'll give you sort of context of what I'm talking about. So originally, it was just the English Nationals. Then Warlord adopted it as the Warlord GT, which is an event that's ran historically. Sort of Warlord have ran that every year, and I think the last year was 2019 because of COVID. And so it's very much the return of the Warlord GT. Now, because of that, they're two very different events. Basically, so the English Nationals is your competitive tournament. People are going to sort of test themselves, test their lists. The Warlord GT has historically always been, I mean, people do go there viewing it as a competitive tournament, but ultimately it is more of a showpiece where it's deliberately as open as possible, allow everything that's ever been published by Warlord to just show off the game, basically. And because of that, it's not a strict competitive tournament in the way that I think the Welsh Nationals would be, for example, where you've got very specific restrictions. And so because of that, it did create some issues, I think. We had some players sort of turning up expecting sort of the Warlord GT, everyone sort of playing thematically, and then we had other players just coming to sort of just play as hard as possible, basically.
It was also part of the British sort of trio of events, wasn't it? The English, the Welsh, and the Scottish Nationals, with the opportunity to play for the overall British champion, for want of a better phrase.
Exactly, yeah. And so this is why people were coming very much to play it as hard as possible, because they're playing for the British Championship. So actually, I suppose the pack would be the first thing to talk about. Now, I know you'd looked at the pack, Phil. What were your thoughts on the pack?
Yeah, so I looked at the pack. I couldn't go. I already made plans for that weekend. So the pack was incredibly open. There was no restriction on the number of selectors. You could take generic platoons, you could take theatre platoons, you could take armoured platoons. There was no restriction on dice, and you could mix and match. So you could take, you could take two theatre selectors for the same nation but different theatre selectors and put that in your army, couldn't you?
Yeah, very much the only guidance was that it should be historical. So the unit should have historically fought together.
Yeah. So it was it's what you said at the start. It was the bolt action GT with regards to what Warlords used to run. Therefore, it was completely open in that sense. But I guess on the flip side, by not saying it's two generic platoons, or by not saying it's only theatre selectors, or by allowing armoured platoons, you're allowing the potential for mismatches, aren't you?
Yeah. And then from the pack perspective, we also had, so the pack was released, and then when Warlord adopted it, they took the pack and zhuzhed it up, didn't they? They did the Warlord treatment to it, and in doing so, they actually changed the wording, didn't they? Which caused a bit of confusion, because originally it was, so this tournament was 750 and 1250, depending on the game.
Yes.
And in the original pack, it just said, make a 750 list, make a 750 list, make a 1250 list. When Warlord had finished sort of formatting it, they changed the wording to make a 750 list, add 500 points to it for your 1250 list, which is a very different set of restrictions.
Yeah, so I'd looked at it, I think, originally when it came out, and then I looked at it again when it Warlord has pushed it with the juicing up, as you say. And I actually like that. I like the fact that the 750 list needed to appear in the 1250, but that wasn't the case in reality, was it?
Yeah, and again, now you've got these two things happening. You're causing a mismatch of expectations again, which if you are a thematic player and you've built the 750 to 1250, and then someone's brought, I don't know, the Street Fighting Academy list in 2 platoons, or the Stalingrad in 2 platoons, and you didn't realise you could do that, I can imagine that's not going to make you very happy.
Yeah, because there's a lot of thinking that needs to go into building a 750 list that has to appear as a 1250 or the constituent of a 1250 list. It's not just like writing 2 platoons from scratch with different points values. You've got to think about how you flex up from 750 to 1250 within that 500 point increase.
Yeah, 100%. And so that caused a little bit of, I mean, there was a third incident where you had a Warlord rep on YouTube saying that it also had to be single platoon, which wasn't referenced in either of the original 2 packs, which again just caused that little bit of confusion. It's a little bit, and then I don't think any of that was ever addressed before the tournament. That
right, okay.
I don't think it was publicly addressed, was it? That we didn't see a re-released pack that nicely clarified everything.
Not to my knowledge, no. I didn't look, to be honest, but not to my knowledge, no.
No, I don't believe I did. And so there was a little bit of confusion basically on what you could take, but ultimately it was one of those ones where you submit a list and just see if it bounces, which
fair enough.
Isn't my favourite thing in the world, but it happens. Equally, because it's sort of the Warlord GT, you've got the 750, 1250 disparity.
Yeah.
You've got all these different things going on. As we get through, again, some of the missions and the tables were unique.
Right.
I would say that anyone listening who is looking at this tournament as sort of a judge of the meta and what they should take to competitive tournaments, I would say this is a bad tournament for that.
Okay.
Because, for example, with the 750, one of the restrictions was there was no armor, which means you can lean heavily into just small arms. And so the ideal for that was to take Schutzen squads from the Western Desert, because if you take 6 of them, you get 120 points free. And then, of course, you're still the Germans, so you still got all those choices and the national characteristics you would normally get with Germany. But you've gained, like, so you're basically taking 870 points to a 750 point game.
Now, did you get the free squads? So if you were British or Soviets, for example, or the French or the Howitzers, did you get that for free at the 750 points value?
Yes, you'd also get that for free.
Okay, so there's the potential there, isn't there, for adding in a lot of extra points for free, either by that additional, say, the LMG and the Schutzen squads, or because you get the free units, depending on the nation you take.
Exactly, yeah. And I think this did the German players did especially well at the 750 because of that, because they knew they weren't going to face any armor, so they didn't have to take any anti-tank really, and they could just pack out on all the LMGs.
Okay.
And so they did better because of that.
Right. So I guess if you're looking at the final results and you're seeing, German armies in the top 5, top 10, you're thinking, hurrah, we've made Germany great again. But actually the pack allowed Germany to become great. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and I think there's actually 2 factors there where the players who finished in the top 10, I think, were all very good players and probably would have finished in the top 10 anyway. But obviously, looking at the pack, they recognised that Germany was a strong choice for this pack. But also, I think that this was a pack that was beneficial to certain armies. So, for example, the LDF platoon, Richard, who was running it, had taken 10 lengths of barbed wire with it.
Okay.
And so if you imagine, I walked past his table when he was playing Sectors, which was the first game, and he just put barbed wire around his quarter. And now this is in a game where tanks aren't allowed.
Right. Yes. If you're playing 750 and you've got no armored vehicles, you
Yeah,
can't drive over the barbed wire to remove it. Yeah.
yeah. So that you can imagine how powerful that is if you've
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
brought and if you basically brought an infantry platoon,
Yeah.
especially something like, I don't know, say you brought your veteran Italians and you're looking forward to a good old game,
Yeah.
and then it turns out you can't actually get into a sector,
Mm.
and so there is a conversation there around the merits of. So what it felt like to me, sort of in summary, is it felt a little bit 40k. So back in the days when I used to play 40k,
Okay.
there used to be the old sort of like pay to win thing where they bring out the latest hotness.
Mm.
You'd go and read about it. You'd go buy all your models. You'd build your platoon.
Hmm.
You'd maybe win a tournament or two, and then they'd release something else to that would knock your thing down.
Mm.
And so you'd have to go out and buy that thing if you want to stay on top.
Hmm.
And obviously, you could still be quite competitive, but it did feel a bit like if you wanted the best army for this particular tournament because it was so unique,
Mm.
you had to go out and buy loads of models.
You presumably those who have a good understanding of theatre selectors as well would have benefited massively, and you don't get that from using Easy Army, for example, because not all of the special rules in the theatre selector are going to be present on Easy Army. So unless you've got the books and you can sit there and read through them and study them and think about what's going to really work, you may be at a disadvantage there as well.
Oh yeah, massively. That was the other reason why it felt very much like that sort of
Mm.
40k days because if you haven't gone out and bought all the campaign books and you've read them all,
Hmm.
you don't know what to expect. Basically, not only have you not brought the strongest thing you could have brought,
Hmm.
you also don't really know what you're going to face because some of the stuff that was coming out was sort of like were theatre selectors that were buried in other books, and
Okay.
so it wasn't the end of the world, as I say. If it was the Warlord GT,
Hmm.
where you're expecting that,
Mm.
not the end of the world, as sort of like a truly competitive tournament, I'd say
Hmm.
it would benefit from tighter restrictions.
Mm. You often hear people say that your dual platoon 1,000 points generic option is stupidly competitive and allows you to do whatever you want. Actually, that's a really great leveler because you're starting at it on a level playing field. You can only take generic units. You've got freedom of choice, obviously, as to what nations you can take. You don't get the funny special rules that appear in theatre selectors, and you can pretty much know what to expect from the two or three types of British platoons, or two or three types of Soviet platoons, or two or three types of US platoons that are effective. You go into a theatre selector event, especially if it's theatre selectors plus generic selectors. There's so many weird and wacky and wonderful things out there in the campaign books that you absolutely can get caught hopping and caught off guard.
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons that I really got into bolt action coming
Hmm.
from 40k was you can build yourself one competitive army and then you might refine it over time, but if you don't want to go out and keep collecting more and more models,
Hmm.
once you've got your army to a reasonably competitive state, it remains competitive.
Hmm.
This format, you couldn't use your standard one in the way that you normally would. You couldn't take your 1,000 points competitive list that you take to every tournament
Hmm.
and drop that in. Now, obviously, there's positives to that
Hmm.
because you can say that, oh, well, it's good because players are being tested. Like, they can't just do the same thing all the time. It's
Yes.
giving them a new challenge. But it does mean that you sort of, because it's so loose,
Hmm.
you don't know what to expect and you are playing.
Okay. So with all of that in mind, in terms of theatre selectors, generic platoons, no dice cap, bring as many platoons as you want, what did you take, Johnny?
Well, I thought about rifling through all the theatre selectors and everything,
Yeah.
but then I was just too busy to go out and build a new platoon.
Okay.
And also, this one was 7 games, so I wanted something that I'm very familiar with playing.
Yeah.
So with all that in mind, I actually just ran my normal Americans. So
Hmm.
I ran a very similar list in the 1250 as I ran at the Welsh Nationals. So
Hmm.
that was 5 engineers, 5 dodgers, 2 officers with a buddy, inexperienced. I took 2 inexperienced heavy mortars, 2 inexperienced Nebelwerfers, well, rocket launchers, and 2 regular Stuarts with recce. So that was my main change, that I took the Stuarts
Yes.
instead of the M6 Dodge carriers with the light and tank gun on the back. I also had 2 squads of 5 Marines with 1 BAR. And then at 750, I basically ran my standard 1,000 list minus a few things. I only ran 3 Dodge carriers and 3 engineers, 2 squads of 5 Marines with 2 BARs.
Hmm.
I ran the classic tractor with a heavy machine gun, the recce jeep, and I took an officer with 2 buddies. And so what the officer did was the 3-man officer team jumped in one of the Dodgers with the engineers to just give them a little boost if they were in reserve outflank.
So 7 games, that's a lot.
It was a lot, and this was one of the things, sort of talking generally about the tournament. The Friday night game, I don't think I'm going to be going to a tournament with a Friday night game again, because it's sort of, there were players who sort of took a day off work, the full day off to get there,
Right, yeah.
to play one game of bolt action. And when you're already giving up a whole weekend to play bolt action, it just seemed a little bit unnecessary and just added a little bit more pressure. Because normally I like to, if I am staying over on the Friday night, I like to use the Friday night to just sort of relax, catch up with people.
Sure, yeah.
But jumping in, game one, Friday night, I was playing against Mike, who brought his Japanese. He had the classic bamboo spear horde. Sort of 140 infantrymen, I think it said on his army list. Now, because we were doing sectors, what he did was he actually reserved about 4 squads of spearmen, I think.
Okay.
And I think the thought process there was he was worried that, A, he physically just couldn't fit them in, and B, because I had the 2 multi-launchers, because this was the 1250 game, I think he was worried that they were just going to get hit with high explosive.
Plus, you've got prep bombardment as well, which obviously they could shrug off the pins through banzaiing, but they need to have line of sight to something to banzai, don't they?
Yeah. And what he did was he basically just banzaied forward and never went down. And so it just became a bit of a bloodbath, basically.
Right.
There was this sort of dried up riverbed. He'd chosen the sides. He'd set up everything behind this riverbed, and then turn one, just banzaied over into the middle of the table, basically, into this sort of no man's land where there's no cover. And then I just sort of hosed the spearmen down with the Stuarts and the
Dodges and...
Marines with the BAR. Yeah. And what I did was I reserved my 5 Dodgers with engineers on. Rather than putting them in my zone, there wasn't really a great way out without walking into a banzai. So I'd reserved them, planned to use them as a counter, because I knew he was coming to me anyway. But actually, the first turn they arrived, the 4 flamethrowers missed, and 3 of them ran out of fuel. And so, funnily, I didn't use the flamethrowers, I think, at all in this game. But because he was just walking into no man's land and his spearmen in reserve kept filling their reserve rolls, it actually, by the time they arrived, everything on the table was basically gone. And then turn 6, I think he did actually go down with a couple of units finally. But yeah, that was a really big win. And not at all what I was expecting. I was expecting to be unable to stop them. And I think just the staggered arrival because of the reserves, I think was a huge help there.
Japanese is one of the few lists that you don't like playing with when you've got your flamethrower Americans, because they have asbestos pants.
Exactly, yeah. And normally I don't run the Stuarts. The Stuarts here did a lot of heavy lifting, because as soon as one of those squads jumped over the wall into the open, the Stuarts would do sort of 18 attacks on it. So they'd be killing sort of 4 or 5 of them in the first round of shooting, and then 4 or 5 in the next round. The squad's basically gone at that point. So that was game 1, which put me in a good spot. And then game 2, Brussels. So effectively it was no man's land. The table had a railway that went diagonally the full length of the board. And then the TO had ruled that railroads are rough, which means that infantry are going to walk 6 inches over them and your wheel vehicles can't cross it full stop. You actually could cross the train track on the road. There were 2 roads. Both of them were basically straight, with like enough bends that you couldn't go the 48 inches, but with clear line of sight to both table edges. And so anything that goes on the road can be seen from both players' edges. And so my wheeled vehicles can't cross the tracks anywhere but the roads. And if they do cross on the roads, they're in full line of sight to everything he's got. And he's running the Schutzen with the 3 LMGs. He's running a truck with a heavy autocannon on the back. And he's running those Aufklärung Kubelwagen with the MMGs on. And so everything he's got is a threat to my soft skins. So I can only go up the road. The road is clearly visible, so it's a bit of a no-go. Outflank. Couldn't outflank either, because the way that the terrain was set up, he physically couldn't enter in a wheeled vehicle. And so the only way for my soft skin transports to get across the table was to go straight up the road. And if my infantry decided to foot slog, they can't run 12 inches the turn across the railroad. So again, they're spending 1 or 2 turns in the open as well. So the table was bad for movement, compounded by the fact it was no man's land.
Especially because you need to get close to him because of the way your army's built.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I did have a heavy mortar and a rocket launcher, but he's not daft. Every time there's a risk he's going to lose a squad, he's going to go down. At this tournament as well, there's no secondaries, so there's no incentive for him to leave his sector or his deployment zone. It became very obvious he was just going to play for the draw, which is what I suspected, to be honest, because it was going to be a tough one for him to come at me with, because as I say, he's just rocking machine guns, and if I'm going down, he's not going to finish anything off. And so, of course, he just set up on his back table edge. And so, anyway, what I did was I put the 3 dodgers, 3 engineers in reserve, and I thought, rather than just playing 6 turns, hiding both of us hiding behind stuff, what I thought was, what I'll do is I'll chance it, because he reserved his Kubel wagons and his truck with the heavy autocannon. I thought, what I'll do is I'll play for last dice, and if a turn does come up where I've got the last 3 dice, I'm just going to rush him with the 3 dodgers, and then it'll probably still be a draw because we'll just exchange dice basically, but at least something happened in the game. And so, incredibly, end of turn 3, I believe it was, we got to a point where he was going down in reserve with all of his vehicles, ready to counter if I rushed forward. And it just so happened that I got the last 3 dice, which was my 3 dodgers to rush up the road. And I thought,
now's the time to do it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I rushed forward with the first one, rolled my reserve check. He came on, he rushed forward, I think about 34 inches was as far as he could get with his 1 turn. And then the next dice, rolled for my next one, and he'd taken Brandenburgers, so I'm at -1 on the test. Mm-hmm. And my regular dodge rolled a 9.
Okay.
So he's off.
Yeah.
At that point, I'm thinking it's problematic, but the game isn't over. And then rolled my third one with the officer, and he would normally be testing at 10 with the Brandenburgers. He's testing at a 9, and of course he rolls a 10. So he's off as well.
Right.
So basically, I've got this 1 dodge with 1 squad in it.
Yeah.
Just
out on the limb.
12 inches from his table edge.
Yeah,
exactly. And obviously, he can't activate for the rest of that turn. But next turn, they're done. Yeah, next turn, his truck comes in, funnily, fails to kill the dodge. Then his Kubelwagen comes in, kills the dodge. The squad go down behind it, carrying behind it. Another dodge for me fails its test and doesn't arrive. So I'm really just feeding him dice piecemeal. Anyway, he killed a second dodge when it came in. My officer squad jumped out and survived, but the engineers, I think, took 3 wounds and then failed a test. So they disappeared. And it basically ended 3 dice to none.
Right. Okay.
So he basically got that dodge that went out on a limb.
Yeah.
He got the second dodge that arrived too late. And the engineers that went side took the shrapnels that fell out.
Yeah.
And those were the 3 dice. So that was that game. In the third game, it was sort of a village. So it was actually quite a good table. I liked this one. Martin Knowles was the opponent. We played a controversial one. We played Hold Until Relieved.
Okay, quite interesting.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
I think he got to choose whether to be attacker or defender.
Right.
And I'm quite glad he made me defender, because the problem with this mission is the attacker can set up his infantry anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if I could have stopped myself just setting up all of my infantry on his back line to stop his first wave coming in. Which would have been totally legal, but it would have been not in the spirit of the game.
No, at all.
And to be honest, I probably wouldn't have. But equally, I might have done it just to see what happens. But anyway, he made me the defender.
Yeah.
I put a squad in the recce jeep in the middle of the table. His rangers set up 18 inches from my squad in the middle.
Did the Rangers lead the way? Yeah.
Yep. And then charged the squad in the middle.
Okay.
Turn 1 with the first dice, basically, and just wiped that squad.
Yeah.
It was a really nice move.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, it then left them sitting there, and I just brought all the engineers in. This was a 750 game. So game 2 was a 750 points game. Mm-hmm. Game 3 was a 750 points game as well. Yeah. So, yeah, after that point, effectively, where engineers just came in, they were able to get to the middle of the table pretty quickly in their dodges. And then I just circled the wagons, basically putting things on ambush. Mm. And so there was plenty of time for me to reinforce the middle, because he had a lot of stuff sort of off the table at the beginning.
Right, I see. Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so I have to say, I'm still not convinced on Hold Until Relieved. I don't think it's a good tournament mission, if I'm honest.
No, I'm surprised, to be honest, when you said that was the third mission, but yeah.
Yeah, and this was one of the reasons why, again, as the English Nationals, I don't think this was a true competitive tournament like the English Nationals. Mm. But as the Warlord GT, where it's just a demonstration of what can be done with the system.
Sure.
Hold Until Relieve, sure.
Yeah.
It wasn't bad. It was a really enjoyable game, I must say.
Good.
It was, and it didn't feel too one-sided. Mm-hmm. So there's just that opportunity to cheese it, isn't it?
So we're now? Game 3, we've got 2 wins and a loss?
Yep. We've had a win, a loss, and a win.
Mm-hmm.
Going into game 4, so I was playing Kenny with his Australians. Very cool list, and it actually won the best painted list as well. So well done, Kenny. And it looked the part. So game 4, where we're going to play an absolute classic meet and engagement.
Yep.
You've got a similar sort of problem where if someone decides just to play for the draw and hides, you're in trouble. This was on a Stalingrad table. Stalingrad looks good, but I do find at tournaments especially, it can be a bit messy for rules.
And we talked about that a little bit in the terrain episode where we said, particularly with things like rough, dense terrain, it does need to be clear where the edge of the boundaries are. And similarly, when you've got, a Stalingrad ruin, which is multi-story, but it doesn't operate like a house because it's a ruin.
Yeah, exactly. And so it should just be single story, as in you can only walk on the ground.
Yes. Okay.
But anyway, we played that game. I outflanked my Dodgers, 750 again, so I'm outflanking the 3 engineers. I did the classic thing where I just clumped everything in one corner and he spread really wide, which meant half of his army really didn't do much for half the game until he'd repositioned them. And then in the end, we ended, I think it was like 5 dice to 3 at the end.
Mm-hmm.
We only got to the end of turn 5, I believe.
Okay.
And I ended up 2 dice up, so I managed to win that one.
Yep. So we're at 3-1 now.
Yep, 3 wins and a loss.
Mm-hmm.
So then that takes me into game 5, where we're back to 1250.
Okay.
So bear it in mind at this point, you've played a game on Friday night. You've then played 3 games on Saturday at 750.
750, yeah.
And then you're into a longer game to end the day. So
Okay.
1250 game 5.
That's heavy going.
It is a lot, yeah. And I made a huge mistake in this one, just because I was so tired. Yeah, so game 5, I was playing Paul Wickens. 1250, as I said. He had brought a 28 dice list.
Okay. And this was Soviets, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was the Street Fighting Academy.
Yeah.
If I'm honest, like this was one that I wasn't expecting.
Mm-hmm.
And when I saw the list, I was very surprised.
Right.
Because he had 4 of the M30 rocket launchers, which are the multi-launchers with a 4-inch template, but they go off with such a bang you have to rally the turn after you shoot them.
That's right, yeah.
He had 6 dog teams, he had 2 engineer teams in body armor with a flamethrower, and he had 2 flamethrower teams. And those 4 units were in trucks, obviously, so they can get nice and close.
Yeah. Okay.
So it was a bit of a mad list.
It's a nasty list, yeah.
It is, yeah. And this is exactly the kind of list where English nationals, sure thing, that's fine. But I imagine if you've rocked up with...
Yeah, your super thematic chindits where you've got no vehicles. Yeah, you've got native...
And 12 dice.
12 dice, native irregulars. You've got your chindits and LMGs. They're all veteran, yeah.
Yeah, and then he rocks up with his 28 dice with his 6 dog teams. And
4 M30s. Yeah, okay.
And so anyway, and we were playing point defense, the one where you set up 3 objectives as the defender, and then this had a twist on it. So the twist on this one was the attacker chose one of the objectives, and that was the only objective that mattered for the outcome of the game.
Okay.
If I'm honest, it's not a good mission, because effectively what happened was I chose one of the objectives, so he set them up in the classic 1 in the centre. The closest they can be to each other is 24 inches, so he put the 2 as satellites, 24 inches apart, as close to his side as possible, which was 6 inches he was allowed. And then, so all I did was I just chose one side and outflanked my 5 engineers to that side.
And just stacked on that one objective, yeah.
Whereas what he had to do in defence was spread really wide with everything because he doesn't know which side I'm coming to.
And then react
Yeah.
at the point at which he knows, but it might be too late to react.
Exactly, yeah. So,
Yeah.
not a good mission, in my opinion, for competitive play.
Okay.
Fun enough, and it was super intimidating facing down 4 of the heavy rocket launchers.
Yeah.
And the first few turns, so first 3 turns before my outflank's coming in, I'm having to be really cagey with my line of sight and hiding behind woods and things. And I did exactly what sort of the advice is, sort of stay out of line of sight and try to rush them as best you can. And so the first 3 turns, I was just sort of trying to hide behind woods and stuff. I rushed the Stuarts forward to get them within 6 inches of one of his spotters because then he couldn't target the Stuart, which worked really well. But actually, so the mistake I made here was because he had 28 dice and I had 20 with 10 in reserve, I actually spent quite a lot of the first few turns just sat down. And I was advancing the Stuarts forward, but I knew he had the engineers in the truck. And so they've got sort of a threat range of 24 inches because the truck comes on 12, they jump out 6, can flame 6. And there was a road that went to the corner of the table on his side, and there was a house on the road. And as I was sat down, I'd sort of got in my mind that that road just went to the side of the table, but actually it went to the corner where the 2 sides meet, and so he had access to it from his table edge.
So he could bring on the truck from his table edge if he needed to. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's exactly how I got myself caught out, because I'd advanced one of the Stuarts, up the table on that side,
Mm.
and I advanced it deliberately about 22 inches so that I was close enough to his men it couldn't be targeted,
Mm.
but I figured I was safe from his flamethrowers. And then, of course, totally forgotten about this road.
Mm.
He brought the truck down the road and he managed to flame the Stuart by just jumping through the woods,
Yeah.
which I felt like a bit of a plum at the time. But ironically, I actually think it was quite a beneficial thing because it meant that he'd committed half of his flamethrowers
Yep.
to just one of my units.
Sure.
And so actually it worked out pretty well. And then eventually my units were within 12 of his force, basically, which meant it was very hard for him to get one of those rocket launcher shots off. My flamethrowers all arrived on the right flank, and then up close, other than his engineers, everything else was really squishy. Because obviously to get 28 dice, it's all shirkers and free units and dogs, etc.
Yeah.
And so I then just sort of trundled over his army once my whole force had arrived. And it ended with, I got the objective, winning the game, and the dice count was 23 dice I killed, and he took 7 off me.
Okay.
So it was one of those games where actually I think at the start of turn 3, I think I was actually down 5 dice to 3. And then it was just one of those games where once I got up in his face, he just didn't have any hard-hitting units at close range once he'd committed the flamethrowers to deal with mine.
And it just swung massively, yeah.
Yeah, just a huge swing.
Okay.
I mean, that was terrifying, though. Those M30s, I don't think they're amazing, like, in the game, because you're only shooting every other turn.
But if you've got 4, presumably Paul was firing 2 in one turn, and then the other 2 in the next turn, and he's reloading with the first 2 in that second turn.
That's the intention, yeah. But I didn't give him enough line of sight to do that. And then on top of that, he'd also spent, I think that's 65 points regular. So times that by 4, you're at 260 points, plus the 4 spotters, 300 points. So he spent more than a fifth of his army on these 4 units.
Sure.
That, in a normal game, I think, if it had just been sort of kill points, they would have done a lot of work for him. But because the mission was just for me to get as close as possible to him, where they don't want me to be anyway.
Yeah.
It really went. It was one of those ones where the mission and the 2 armies sort of led to the outcome.
Okay.
More than, because he is a very good player.
Absolutely, yeah. So we're now end of the second day. You're what, 4 wins and 1 loss?
I think that's correct, yeah.
Okay, and you've played.
I mean, I'm exhausted even just talking through these games. It was too many games for me.
You've played 2 1250 games and 3 750.
Exactly, yeah.
So Sunday, you've got 2 1250 games left?
Yep, 2 1250s.
Okay.
Game 6 is against Rich,
Yeah.
who won Best Englishman overall, so well done, Rich. Which might give you a bit of a spoiler as to how the mission goes. We played Top Secret, again, a variation on it, and one that actually, I believe we said this variation isn't a great decision when we went through the missions in episode 4. So in this one, the change was the objective couldn't move.
Right. So you're basically playing key position.
Yep.
In the middle of the board.
Yeah.
And how did you have control of the top secret briefcase that you were fighting over? Was it how did you contest it?
So it was just the usual 3 inches, like key position. So
okay, so it's key position, bang in the middle of the board.
Yeah, exactly. And that was one of the things that I clarified, because in Top Secret you do have to advance onto it, don't you, to pick it up or run.
Yes. Did you use the 12 inches at either side of the board at all in the game, or did you just play down a narrow little strip?
Not much, to be honest. Okay. It basically played out exactly the way that we said doing this would make it play out.
Okay.
So Rich has his Gurkhas. He has 2 Stuarts. Yeah. He has a 25 pounder. He has a forward artillery observer and a sniper, that kind of stuff. I think he might also have a mortar as well. Oh, and a flamethrower and a jeep.
Yeah.
I've got, as you're aware, all my flamethrowers. Now, there was a forest in the middle of the table. The objective was in the forest, which meant actually you could advance almost to the middle of the table without being seen.
Right.
There was sort of line of sight down the sides where my rocket launchers could see buildings to have a little pop at them. So what I did was I rocked up. I basically just rushed the engineers to behind the forest.
Yeah.
He basically went to do the exact same thing.
With his Gurkhas.
And Rush's Gurkhas, yeah. He failed a couple of Gurkha tests to come onto the table from reserve.
Okay.
And so you only had sort of 2 units of Gurkhas at the end of turn 1 on the table.
Right.
Turn 2, though, right up against the woods. My engineers are right up against the edge of the woods.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that happened at the end of turn 1 was he brought his truck on with nothing on it, and he got a really lucky diagonal shot. Sure enough, just happened to pop it, which then, of course, caused a bit of a roadblock for my dodges later on.
Right.
But effectively what happened was I knew it was just going to turn into a 6-inch who pulls the other dice first game, because we're both playing that. There's only one objective. And so I thought, because he's a bit piecemeal, because some of his units are in reserve, like one of his stewards failed their test.
Okay.
I thought, you know what, I'm just going to start going for it, start flaming.
Mm-hmm.
And so I advanced everything sort of within 6. Nothing really happened until the start of turn 4. I had one unit on the objective with one pin, because they'd fallen out the dodge. His Gurkhas were about 4 inches from them. At this point, I said, whoever gets the next order dice, it's probably going to decide the game, because effectively you're either going to charge me or I'm going to flame you, and then it's just going to cascade from there. I got first order dice, and then the engineers failed their test on one pin. And so his Gurkhas then charged the other engineer squad who were in the woods, who hadn't activated yet, but they're point blank, so I can't react. That kills that one. His original Gurkha squad that I was going to flame, they're now free to act as they wish. I think they do mop that squad up. His other Gurkhas are arriving now, and it basically it turned into just luck of the dice effectively in the middle.
Right, okay.
Not a good mission at all, in my opinion.
Okay.
And so that game ended effectively. He ended with a few units in the woods. My multi-launchers didn't go off at all until the last turn. I killed sort of 2 or 3 units in the woods, I think. At one point early in the game, I got a hit on his Gurkhas, got something like 7 hits, and rolled 6 ones. It was one of those games where it was just, we're basically letting luck decide who wins, and the luck wasn't with me. So, Rich got that one. So now I'm on 2 losses and 4 wins. So the final game, I'm going up against Chris of the South Wales Warlords, who I believe was at the Warlords Cup day.
Yes, he was. Yeah, Chris. Yeah.
Yeah, very good player. Knows the rules very well.
Yeah, very good player.
So we played key positions, and I stacked the table. So I did exactly what we've talked about before, where it was 4 objectives. He placed one on one side of the table, so I placed my 2 in sort of an equilateral triangle, 12 inches apart on that side of the table. It was sort of like a village map. The reason I did that is because it was that town square, there were enough roads that I thought I'll be all right trying to get across the table. And so we rolled off for sides. I got lucky and I got to choose sides, so I chose a side with 3 objectives. It wasn't at all what I was expecting, so I was a little bit, so I didn't really have a battle plan at that point, because my battle plan had been to race across the table to get those objectives, which sort of knocked me off a bit. And I also felt a little bit bad that I'd stacked the table and now he had to come across the table. So that's the context for the game. Effectively, he deployed really wide. He sent sort of a Steward, his flame tank, his Tokarev down one flank. He sent some stuff down the other flank, like another Steward, a Bren carrier down the other flank. He put one of the tank hunter teams right in the middle of the table, actually in the open. And the turn my Steward turned up, it put, I think, 13 shots into them, or maybe it's even 18, and did 1 pin. So they got really lucky. And then the next turn, the Steward had advanced, shot the Bren, got a really lucky shot on this Bren, and again put 13 shots into these tank hunters, but they went down, couldn't kill them. And then, so later in the game, my Stewards he then fousts the Steward from inside a ruin, so he's given me hard cover because he's not up against the boundary. He gets the hit even with the hard cover, and then rolls a 1 on the side armor. And so it doesn't wreck it. And so I thought, phew, there's a lucky escape.
Yeah.
And then basically what happened was turn 4. I'm thinking this is wrapped up because my engineers, I sent 2 squads of engineers in on the left flank, took out a Steward there. I got lucky with a rocket launcher on the other flank, took out a Tokarev and a Steward. So he really doesn't have a lot of stuff left at this point. He's got an engineer squad and a Bren, a flame tank, and the free squad. And then he's got 1 squad that are all the way on his side holding his objective. And then I was worried, basically, I'm now thinking, this is like that game earlier where it feels a bit pointless.
Yeah.
Like, I'm worried that from his perspective, this feels a bit pointless because the table was a bit loaded. He was having to advance up sort of on the back foot. And so what happened was I got a little bit cocky. I thought, you know what, I'm going to commit these dodges with engineers into the middle of the table because I've got such an advantage at the minute. like having killed so much important stuff,
Sure.
I'm just going to commit them. So I sent one dodge up, parked it sort of 9 inches from his Bren carrier that had the engineers in,
Yeah.
so we could play sort of the who gets next order dice game. And then, of course, he did and killed the dodge with the engineers. But that was fine because I could then mop them up because I was basically waiting for him to commit them. The big problem was I then sent the second dodge like immediately after to play the same game against this inexperienced rifleman who were hiding behind a wall. And again, so I parked about 9 inches from this wall. His rifleman jumped over the wall bravely and then popped the dodge.
Okay.
And then because of that, they then basically had these 2 dodges that created a wall of cover for the objective in the middle of the table.
Yeah, sure.
And then, of course, the first time I shoot these inexperienced riflemen, they pass their green test and go to regular,
Of course, yeah.
which is a huge boost. And then anyway, so I still wasn't particularly worried. I thought, well, that's nice that like we've had a bit of back and forth, but I've still got both my stewards. One of them was going to basically, because it has recce, it can advance at full rate. It did this amazing maneuver where it went 18 inches backwards down the road into the square with its turn, because it's recce, and it basically turned so that it was facing my table edge, so it could shoot those regular riflemen on the objective. So it's done this. It's basically done it around that ruin that the tank hunters were in. But I wasn't worried because they shot their Faust. And so it came around, it shot his Katusha, killed his Katusha, the steward, which is amazing. And then it killed sort of like 1 or 2 riflemen. But again, I wasn't worried because the next turn I was just going to turn it and park point blank from these riflemen and just hose them down.
Sure.
And then the following turn, he got the dice. Sorry, at the end of that turn, I think, his tank hunters activated, charged the steward, and I knew it was a possibility, but I wasn't particularly worried because obviously it's moved, so he needs 6s to hit. It's armor 8, so I mean he's going to get 4 dice.
And this is a 4-man squad, yeah?
2-man squad.
2-man squad, okay.
But they've got
tough tank fighters.
Yeah, tough tank fighters. So they get 2 attacks each.
Yeah.
But I thought they'll roll 1-6 and then they can't hurt it. So he charges in because he doesn't really have much else to deal with my steward at this point.
Yep.
Rolls 4 6s.
Of course. Yeah.
And then a 6 to pen.
Okay.
And then, of course, rolls, I think it was a 5 and blows it up.
Blows it up, yeah.
And so I had the back 2 objectives and the one in the middle he's now sat on. I still had sort of 2 engineer squads, a steward and the officer there, but the engineer squads had a couple of pins each and the steward was shooting over the soft-skinned vehicles that I'd given him for cover.
Yeah, okay.
Like an idiot, the Rex. And then turn 5, so this flame vehicle has just been slowly plodding down his left flank. And it went sort of 18 inches turn 1. Turn 2, it went 9 because I had to go through a ruin. And then it's just plodded. Turn 5, it finally got close enough. It actually swung around on my table edge and flamed the objective and cleared the objective.
Right.
I couldn't believe it.
Yeah.
I'd basically just written that vehicle off because normally they're sort of hitting on a 5. They never hit, do they?
Yeah, and it's got a long way to go to get there. And yeah.
Yeah. And then, as I said, I had loads of infantry left. So I had another squad that, before he did that, there was another squad in the road ready to move back on that objective. They were just sort of stood in the open because he didn't really have much that could do anything to them. But what he did was he used, I think, his sniper to just pop a couple of pins on them. And then, sure enough, they failed their test to get back on the objective. And so the game ended. We actually ran out of time. We only got to turn 5.
Okay.
But the game ended with, I safely had one objective.
Yep.
The one in the middle was contested because my officer was within 3 of it
Yep.
and his regular infantry was in 3. The one on my back table edge was just clear.
Yep.
And then the one on his back table edge, he just sat on all day.
Right.
So it ended up with 1 each and 1 contested.
Yeah, okay.
So it just goes to show you, like, don't get complacent.
No, not at all.
To be honest, I'm glad it ended the way it did because I think if I'd just reserved my engineers until they had guaranteed kills, it would have been a bit of a tedious game. And actually it turned into a really funny, sort of like enjoyable game because of it.
Back and forth.
Yeah. So that put me on a draw.
Okay.
So I've got 2 losses, a draw, and 4 wins.
4 wins, yeah.
Yep. So that puts me overall joint 6th in the tournament.
Fantastic, well done.
Thank you very much, sir. Which a lot of the Welsh were lingering near the top, so that actually made me the 2nd best English player as well.
Okay.
So the way the trophies were awarded was basically there was first place was the Warlord GT winner.
Overall winner for the whole 7 games over the weekend.
Yep, and that went to Gary Morgan. Really well done to Gary.
Fantastic, well done, Gary.
Really deserved it. So I played Gary at Welsh Nationals, as we discussed earlier in an earlier episode, and he used my trick on the weekend. So he
Right.
did the exact thing where he circled the wagons around an objective, he was telling me.
Yeah.
So I didn't get to play him, which was a bit of a shame because I always enjoy playing against Gary.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
it just goes to show that that's why he's such a good player, because it's the old fool me once.
Yeah, it happened to him. He'd seen how you played it against him. He now uses it later on. Yeah, fantastic.
So Gary came first overall. Well
Yeah.
done to Gary.
Fantastic.
You then had, in the Warlord GT rankings, you then had Richard C, who was using the sort of Gurkha platoon. Yeah, Rich, who had played in Game 6. And then third place in the Warlord GT, you had Richard Gedney, who was using the Luftwaffe Defence Force list, which is the one where you get all the free barbed wire.
Yeah. Brilliant.
Brilliant. So that was the Warlord GT results. You then had the English national results, which was running in tandem.
Yep.
And basically the awards for that were the best English player, second best, etc., etc.
Okay.
And so Rich C, as second overall, obviously won the best English player, as Gary is Welsh.
Fantastic. Well done, Rich.
I then won second best English player.
Okay, because the Welsh were filling up the gaps between Rich and you. Yeah.
Yeah. So the Welsh took first, third, fourth, fifth, I believe.
So that's quite similar to the Welsh Nationals, where the English players, quite a few of the English players finished in the top 5 or 6.
Yeah.
Pushing the Welsh down a little bit.
Exactly, yeah.
So, Johnny, give us your overall thoughts then on the weekend itself.
So the venue is very good. Britcon's always at Nottingham University. Because of that, they also use the halls. So when you buy your ticket, you can actually buy your accommodation at the same time, which is brilliant. It just makes it really easy. Loads of space, plenty toilets. There's a bar usually on the Saturday.
Yep.
So really good venue. So I'd give the venue sort of like a 9 out of 10. There's not much that could improve it. The only issue I ever have is you have to park in the car park. It's quite expensive. But other than that, I cannot fault the venue. The tables, generally very good. As I had that one table, that was an absolute nightmare.
Right, okay.
Because the layout wasn't great, combined with the mission, not good. But I'd say overall, sort of a 8 out of 10 for the tables. Not bad at all. The pack, now, as a Warlord GT pack, I'd say this is a 9 out of 10. Like, they could do with a little bit more clarity. But generally, for the Warlord GT, where it's not strictly competitive as part of a larger competition, sure, it was fine. As an English Nationals pack, I'd have to give it something like a 5 out of 10. It really was not, it wasn't strict enough. The missions, a lot of those missions were not tournament missions.
No, it doesn't sound like it. Yeah, as soon as you mentioned, top secret and hold to relief, for example. Yeah, okay.
Also, no double envelopment.
Right, okay.
So we're playing these missions that are basically just walk into the middle of the table and roll some dice, like Top Secret is. And at the same time, we never played double envelopment, which I thought was a real loss. Because obviously I like it because I'm fast, but equally, your LDF force with all his barbed wire, he was going to love that. And so I thought that was a real shame. And so, as I say, the pack for me was not a good Nationals pack. Again, there were no secondaries.
Right.
So there was nothing to draw people out. And it also meant that because it was just win, loss, draw, there was no massive wins and minor wins. You end up with a lot of people on the same points at the end of the tournament.
Yeah, it's going to get very difficult to differentiate, isn't it?
Yeah. So we had 3 people in joint second who had to be split by dice difference.
Yeah.
We had 6 people in joint sixth. You then went down to the 12th position and you had 5 people in joint 12th. And so those secondaries
would have made a big
would
difference.
have really helped because all the way down the table it was like that.
Sounds to me like it was an event with a bit of a split personality, because on the one hand, it, as a Warlord GT, 7 games over the weekend, bring what you want, let's showcase the game and showcase how you can play it. Some missions that you might find quite enjoyable if you're sort of playing casually or at the club, like hold until relieved or point defense. Equally, it was also the English Nationals competitive part of the British Championship. People are going there to build on how they've done at the Welsh Nationals, and those two don't quite marry together.
Exactly. So on that note, the good news is next year the 2 events will be split. So that should solve that problem.
Okay, brilliant.
You'll have the Warlord GT at Britcon, and the English Nationals will be moving to Roll Call, which happens in April. If you want information on that, you can head to the British Historical Game Society website.
Fantastic. Okay.
And I think that should hopefully solve that problem of sort of the players' expectations. Because I think when you've got players coming in with different expectations, that's when you have those historical players really coming up with friction against the competitive players.
Sure.
And so that nicely segments that. And hopefully that'll give us lots of clarity for the next English nationals as to what's allowed.
And it's not just your historical players going up against your competitive players. You know, it's the person who brings the thematic list where they're paying over the odds for certain units, etc., because it works. Not necessarily because they're out and out historical players. They just fancy playing something a bit different. But then they come up against that person who's finely tuned their list within the restrictions, and that can leave a bit of a sour taste.
100%, yeah. And so hopefully that'll nicely solve that next year. I do hope that neither event has a Friday night game, because I don't think that added anything to the tournament. And I think, actually, I know Warlord were aiming for 80 people for the GT, and I think that Friday night game was a big deterrent for a lot of players.
Yeah. I could see that if you had a 2-day, 5 or 6 game weekend without the Friday night, and it's the GT format, so bring what you want, anything's possible, you absolutely can see, huge numbers going to something like that. Because if you then split off your English nationals, very competitive, part of the British Championships, that's going to filter people to a different event at a different time of year. We're not mixing our messages between the two.
100%, yeah. So a bit of a mixed bag with those tournaments, I'd say, Phil.
Yeah, I say the Warlords Cup was great. Yeah, the first time it's been run. Well done to Reese and Andy for putting it together. Thank you, and well done to everybody that turned up as well. It was really, really good fun. I certainly enjoyed it. And yeah, 1-day event, nice and easy to get to from where I am to Warminster for Factorum. So yeah, no complaints there at all.
Brilliant. Yeah, Britcon wasn't a great competitive tournament, but it was a great tournament. I thoroughly enjoyed the weekend, and I would recommend it, especially next year when it's just the Warlord GT. I think it'll be another brilliant weekend. So get yourself a ticket for that if you are planning to get down when they get released.
Thanks everyone who has liked, shared and subscribed so far. Thanks everyone as well who has put comments on the Facebook post and also messaged us directly. Please keep the comments coming. Please keep the likes, share and subscribes coming. It's fantastic the support that's out there.
Thank you for listening. Please leave us a review. Ta-ta for now.
Ta-ta for now.